Sandwiched between the iconic 2009 and 2011 draft classes, where we saw the rise of so many superstars and noteworthy players, the 2010 class was, well, quite forgettable. Of course, like most classes, there were still some all-stars, but it seems like by now, for one reason or another, most of this class has dropped off significantly. Even those who were once considered very prominent players. How's it going, folks? My name's Andy, and today let's take a dive into the 2010 draft class. A class with some well-known stars, but many players who had a strong start fell off very quickly. Injuries, a changing role, and a changing NBA landscape were all part of that. Very few players, if any, from this class will leave a legacy in the history books. And if you look down the draft board, you'll see why. Aside from a handful of stars, this was a class that largely underachieved. Anyway, let's get started. As of now, this class has produced 4 All-Stars: John Wall, DeMarcus Cousins, Gordon Hayward, and Paul George. That's below average for a typical draft class and a bit fewer than 2009 and 2011, which have 6 and 7 respectively. Plus, 3 of those 4 stars, Wall, Cousins, and Hayward, have not been All-Stars since like 2018. They all suffered major injuries at some point in their careers, with Wall having multiple knee injuries and a torn Achilles. Those piled up and caused his game to suffer, although he's still pretty damn good. Hayward shattered his ankle in a tragic way, and it took a few years for him to fully recover. With a bench role in Boston, his usage got severely limited, but he also bounced back, like Wall. Cousins, however, the torn ACL and the torn Achilles were too much to overcome. The once dominant big man, arguably the best center in the league at his peak, is now a mere bench warmer. That's sad to see. Paul George also faced his fair share of adversity, especially with that broken leg, but since then, he has aged like fine wine, having the best seasons of his career as he got older. I'd say, as of now, he is the best and most accomplished player of this class. The most All-Star selections, the most All-NBA and All-Defense nominations too. Unfortunately, besides those 4 players, this class has been quite underwhelming. John Wall was the first overall pick, and more or less, he has lived up to his expectations, but the 3 picks right after him did not. Evan Turner, the second pick, had some decent years in Philly, I guess, but he was nothing more than the precursor for the Sixers' tanking saga. Him, Andre Iguodala, Drew Holiday, Lou Williams, Thaddeus Young, they had a solid team, even making a few playoff appearances while Turner was there. However, as the Sixers moved on and wanted to rebuild in their own way, they no longer had any use for Turner, who was still fairly young, but they knew he wasn't the guy who could turn this franchise into a contender. From the perspective of the Sixers front office, Turner failed to live up to his hype. This dude was the Big Ten Player of the Year and the tournament MVP. That's why, despite being nearly 22 years old at the time of the draft, he was still picked so high. By 2014, he got traded to the Pacers and had some issues with Lance Stevenson. The Pacers were dominating, but after this trade, Turner never developed any chemistry with the team. While he did make a comeback in Boston, by 2020, he announced his retirement at the age of 32. Joining the Celtics staff as an assistant coach. The 3rd pick of the draft was Derek Favors. You might recognize him as a solid, consistent role player for much of his career, and that's completely true. His draft comparison coming in was Al Horford, and while Favors did not have the same impact, nor the All-Star selections as him, I think it's a fair comparison. Favors never made any team worse. When he's on the floor, he makes a positive impact. He's still playing and still contributes, although his hopes and dreams of becoming a star has long faded away. The funny thing is, I've always felt like Favors was like 25 years old for like a solid decade. It seems like he was so young for most of his career, and now all of a sudden, he's like 30. People were waiting so long for him to make the jump, but he just never did. But unlike him, the 4th pick, Wesley Johnson, was a lost cause right when he stepped foot on the NBA court. another older rookie at 23 years old when he played his first NBA game. His ceiling was low, but most scouts believed he was NBA ready and could produce right away, without needing much development. Well, it turned out to be far from true. Despite being touted as a Shawn Marion type of player, Johnson struggled with pretty much everything. He was fast and athletic, but he had no basketball game sense. A report prior to the draft described him like this: Johnson is a perfect small forward for any team with a ball-dominant guard. He's extremely active without the ball in his hands, very efficient, extremely productive, doesn't need many minutes to make an impact, but doesn't disappear for long periods of time either. However, it was actually the complete opposite. For long periods of time, you didn't even realize he was on the floor, cause he was just standing around doing nothing. I've always thought of him as a guy who had so many tools and physical gifts, but didn't know what to do with them. By 2019, he was waived by the Wizards and headed to the EuroLeague. DeMarcus Cousins was the 5th pick, and I talked about him earlier. I think early in his career, he was on his way to becoming the best player of this class, but his injury stopped him in his tracks. The 6th pick was Ekpe Udoh. I still remember back in the day, he was so hyped among Warriors fans. He was supposed to be a god on defense, a slender but strong athletic power forward with a massive wingspan. His quickness was unbelievable. Back then, very few big men had the speed to keep up with guards, but Udoh did. His passing and ball handling was superb for his size. At Baylor, he showed an impressive ability to find the open man. He was supposed to become what Draymond Green became. Sadly, his NBA career never took off. It was a combination of not getting much opportunity early on, but also because his raw offensive game never developed. While he showed flashes of brilliance on defense, he was a foul machine, plus arguably the worst offensive big man in the league. The 7th pick. Now, this is a guy who should have been better, Greg Monroe. He had such a strong start to his career, sometimes the media would even say they preferred Monroe over Cousins, because Cousins was too hot-headed, while Monroe was steady and stable. The problem is, while the NBA continued to evolve, Monroe got left behind in the dust. In an era where the game was getting faster and smaller, Monroe was too slow-footed. His bread and butter was simply posting up and backing down his defender to score, the old-fashioned way. A traditional big man playing in the wrong era. It didn't help that he spent his best years playing with Josh Smith and Andre Drummond. So now, you've got 3 guys in the front court who can't shoot. Monroe had a few good years as a bench player in Milwaukee, but after getting traded 6 times in 2 years, he was done. The 8th pick, Farouq Aminu. I still remember on one of his draft day interviews, a reporter asked him who he models his game after. He responded, Carmelo Anthony. Now, it's safe to say he did not live up to that. In fact, they're not even similar in the slightest. On the bright side, Aminu developed into a great all-around wing player. Early on, he struggled with his shooting and quickly developed into a prominent three-point threat. In Portland, he became known as one of the league's best 3-and-D players, a crucial piece to their small lineups. His days of being an important piece are over now, and he's been relegated to a bench warmer, but I think for the 8th pick, he did relatively well. Aminu looked like a clear bust early on, but he redeemed himself as his career progressed. The 9th pick, Gordon Hayward. I mentioned him earlier as well, but I will add on, if it wasn't for that terrible injury in Boston, I think we'd be talking about him the same way we talk about Paul George today. If he kept on the same path after leaving Utah, he could have still been a star, or a secondary star on a contender. I mean, numbers-wise, he's still very good. The 10th pick was Paul George, and he's currently carrying the rest of the class on his back. The rest of the lottery included Cole Aldrich, Xavier Henry, Ed Davis, and Patrick Patterson. But Aldrich and Henry flamed out of the league very quickly. Larry Sanders at 15 was looking like a real prospect until he had a falling out with the coaching staff in Milwaukee, especially with Jason Kidd. He said before that Kidd was a huge reason why he retired prematurely, and how his relentless schedule and overworking caused him to hate basketball. So those were all the guys in the lottery, but besides them, there really aren't that many other significant players. Going down the board, you see some guys like Eric Bledsoe with the 18th pick, who's been around for a long time, playing a significant role on every team he's been on. At his draft position, he turned out pretty well. Avery Bradley, the 19th pick, a feisty defender back in his day and a two-time All-Defender as well. But he hasn't been productive since like 2017. Like most players of this class, the longevity was very poor. The 27th pick was Jordan Crawford. There wasn't much to talk about of his career, but I think everyone knows him as a sixth-man spark plug. The dude bounced around numerous teams, but he'd always play the same way, for better or worse. Occasionally, he'd go off for like 30 points and then fall back down to mediocrity the next day. Gravis Vasquez was the 28th pick, one of the best NBA players to come from Venezuela. The 33rd pick, Hassan Whiteside. He was completely irrelevant until 2014 when he joined the Miami Heat and came out of nowhere to become one of the league's best centers. Back then, it was surprising, and he even led the league in rebounds in 2017. I think out of all the non-stars of this class, Whiteside was the closest to becoming an all-star. It's either him or Bledsoe. With the 40th pick, Lance Stevenson, despite all the memes, he had a fantastic career as the 40th pick, even leading the league in triple-doubles in 2014. And those were the most recognizable players who got drafted, but in addition, you also had a few undrafted players who made some noise. Boban Marjanovic, the gentle giant. Ish Smith, a point guard, a journeyman, who as of 2021 has played for 11 different teams. But with his sheer determination, he's still going strong. Oh, and of course, who could forget Jeremy Lin? One of the greatest stories we've ever seen, even if it only lasted for like 2 weeks. Anyway, that's all folks. Overall, the 2010 class started off kinda strong, but then severely dropped off in recent years. It's also a forgettable class, as even the star players are deemed uninteresting by many accounts. While there have been some stars, I don't think any of them will leave a huge legacy. Over time, this class will be forgotten. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed the video, and of course, as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.